Hi class. In this video, we are going to be talking about how to edit your photos in Lightroom. So we've already learned how to import our photos into Lightroom, how to rate our photos, and how to organize them into collections, and also how to export your photos so that you can submit them for your discussions and for assignments. On top of that, today we're going to be learning about how to edit your photos. And what I want you to know first off is that we always want to take the best image that we can as possible in camera before we go ahead and edit that photo. You are all just beginning, or you may be at different levels of photography, but even myself, like I always do edit my photos just a little bit. I feel like photos can always use a little bit of just a little bit of enhancement. But I also am a big fan of editing my photos in general. Um, so yeah, I learned how to take photographs, but another part of like my love for photography came from editing photographs and changing the way that they look. Um, but just in general, for what you should know is that like try to do your best to take the photo as you would want to take the photo in camera, like with the best exposure as possible, nothing too overexposed or too underexposed. Really thinking about aperture and all those different qualities that you want to like set the mood for your photo. And then with editing, you can enhance those features, not really like cover up those features, for example. Like sometimes editing can get so extreme where it's like not even the photograph anymore. And maybe that's that like the artist's technique. But since you're all just entering this course, I'd really like you to stay to minimal edits depending on the project or the assignment that I'm assigning. But for this first project, and hopefully throughout this course, you just kind of really focus on taking the best photo you can in camera and then adding a little bit of enhancement in editing. So I'm going to go through those steps with you today. And also, just so you know, right now we're in the library. You can see in project one, I have 27 photos. This may be the same for you. Just know that for project one, you do only need 9 photos. So I don't want you to get confused about the 27. Maybe you did bring a good amount of images in here, and then you're going to eventually narrow those down to the final 9 images. But yeah, for me, I just put all these images in project one because these are like my editing files that I just wanted to show all of you. So I have a good selection to choose from. So just in case you're wondering about that number. So moving in from the library, we can now go to the develop module. And if you don't see this bar at the top here, it may be hidden and you can unhide that with the arrow at the top here. There's also arrows on the side. I'm not sure if I said that in the other videos about importing in any of those videos. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but yeah, you can like close down these sides if you wanted to. Um, you could basically like hover over them to have them appear. I like to see everything, so if anything's ever hiding, you can just click the arrow and let it appear again. Your history tab, this shows everything that you've done to the photo. So the difference between when I brought this image in versus to when I completed the image. And the thing about Lightroom that I want you to know, we're going to be using Lightroom in this class, is that Lightroom is non-destructive, which is really awesome for beginner users. It's a really great platform in general for everyone, not even just beginners, but it just makes things really easy because it's non-destructive. So that means that any edit that you make will be in the history, and it will completely just save. So like when you exit out of Lightroom, you don't have to necessarily like save anything. You don't have to worry about constantly saving your file. And I'm referring to Photoshop, and Photoshop is non-destructive, or sorry, Photoshop is destructive. So when you go into Photoshop, when you learn that in the next level of this course, um, basically it's a destructive software because when you bring an image in, you have to know the non-destructive workflows to be able to make it non-destructive. But like, let's say you brought in an image like this and you added a bunch of adjustments on top in terms of like making changes the color or like making it brighter or darker or whatever. Um, And then let's say you saved on top of that, when you brought it in, when you bring it back in, you won't be able to get your original file back. So that's how it can be destructive. Or let's say, I'll show you how to crop in here later, but let's say I cropped in to just this little camera right here, and that's a really big crop to make in this image. So let's say I cropped in and then I didn't do a non-destructive workflow in Photoshop. Then I saved it, and then now my image is only this area, and I can't get any of this information back. So that's why there are ways in which you can make Photoshop non-destructive. Photoshop is still awesome in many ways compared to Lightroom, but Lightroom is great because it's just really simple. It keeps all of your history here. You don't have to worry about saving the file. It will just save everything for you. And when you come back in, you can edit on top of these. You can change things. Like, it's really flexible. So yeah, you can see all the edits that I've made in the history tab here. And then there are some other things like presets, snapshots, etc. You can explore those on your own. I'm not really going to get into those. I'm really just focused on like the actual editing tools we're going to be using on the side here, knowing the history, and then also you can see below here I have my collections. Um, so I'm actually going to bring this image back to the beginning. And you know what, maybe we won't start with this image. Actually, let's see here. I got my list of everything that I want to talk about. Yes, so the first edits to your photo. I'm actually going to go to this image. So this image, the first things that I would do to your image is actually on the right side, you can see your histogram, the basics tab. These are all things I'm going to talk about. All these things close down. You can also close them down. You can open them by clicking the little arrow, or close them by clicking the arrow as well. And I'll be going over these in another video. But what I want you to look at is lens corrections. You can keep that open. And right now we are going to go ahead and enable profile corrections. So that's the first thing. Enabling profile corrections, this is related to your lens, as it says right here, lens corrections. In your photographs, you'll see like vignetting in this like circular shape, which is very much your lens. So for example, I can see this here. If I, like, you can see the vignetting all around the side, you can kind of see like the shape of the lens here, right? And then when I click enable profile corrections, all of that is gone. It's nice and smooth. And it will also get rid of warping. There's not a lot of like, I don't have a lot of images that are like really zoomed in, or I'm not using like a zoom lens at all. So sometimes more of that warping can happen with zoom lenses, and all of these are not really zoomed in. They're just taken right at 35 millimeters. So, or rather 22 millimeter, sorry. Yes, 22 millimeter. And you can see that here, which is also great. And I'll talk a little bit more about the histogram as well, and like what it shows you. And you can kind of see a little sneak peek to that right here. And I think I may have mentioned that in my last video too. But yeah, since we're on the topic, basically, I'm pretty sure I did say this in the last video, but you can see your ISO, your focal length, 22 millimeters, your f-stop here, f2.0, your aperture, and then also your shutter speed right here. So yes, that's how it's broken down. And going back to this image, so what I was talking about was lens corrections. So here I enabled profile corrections. You can see how it's like darker and vignetted, and now it's a lot more lit up correctly. You get that vignette off and also a little bit of that warping. But on top of that, I wanted to show you chromatic aberration. So this is also a tool that you can select, and I would recommend that you do both of these for every single image. It's just like good practice, and that's what I've been doing forever. It's just to like extra make sure that none of this is happening in your images when you can't even see it. So this image looks far from far away, but when I zoom in, you can see these different colors happening. So this is chromatic aberration, and it might look like a cool 3D effect, but as you can see, it's like, you know, this effect would be cool if I applied it to everything, and made it like really big and so you could see it, but you really can't see it until you zoom very far in. So let's say I printed this photograph out and I like made it really large, like the full size of a wall. You could probably see the chromatic aberration in this. Or if I even just like maybe I took a photo of this, just this part, and then in the same exposure, you would see the chromatic aberration. So chromatic aberration is basically when the lens isn't able to render the color wavelengths that are coming through. This happens when there's a lot of contrast in your image, specifically when there's like a harsh white against a darker color. And also, this happens a lot with like reflective metal material, but you can really see it a lot of the time in metal, different metal structures, or mostly when like there's a big contrast in whites and darks. And yeah, we can see that here. So if I click remove chromatic aberration, I can basically get rid of those. And I can kind of still see a little bit of like magenta hanging on, but it's a lot better. So it does its best, and I think it does a pretty good job. And also to explain more about the chromatic aberration, basically, as I said, it's like your lens not being able to um, put that different color information all together. So that's why it separates, and you can see the different green and magenta happening here. And sometimes chromatic aberration, it can be really, it could be like red and blue, it can be different colors, but for here it's green and magenta, which is pretty common. And then, so that happens because of the really intense contrasts that are in the image, and it happens a lot where there's like a lot of bright white and darkness in the image, like a different darker structure, and when there's like specifically reflective metal material. So if I go ahead and remove chromatic aberration, it is gone. And I know, like I said, you can see a little bit of it, but it does a pretty good job because if I go all the way away, we can't see it at all. So hopefully you can see how improved that is. I know it's not like completely perfect, but um, maybe you're like, what are you talking about? You can't see anything, which is great. But I have looked at this for a long time, so I can kind of see that magenta still hanging on there. But it really does do a great job. So as I was doing that, pressing remove chromatic aberration 100 times, you can see that the history has recorded that for me. So it records everything that I do, which is really awesome. And that's why Lightroom is so great because it's so non-destructive. So yes, definitely enable profile corrections and remove chromatic aberration as your first steps in editing any of your photos. Next, I'm going to be talking about the histogram. So I'm actually going to be moving from image to image, but just watch how the histogram changes. And the histogram is something that you can also see in camera depending on your settings. Basically, if you hit info, usually a couple of times, you can see your different settings of your camera, and the histogram will be one of them. And the histogram is basically a graph that's showing us all the different shadows, highlights, colors, and midtones in your image. It's basically like a graphical information about the exposure of your image. So you can see for every image it changes. So like in a dark image like this, the histogram is pushing all the way to the left side. And in a bright image like this, the histogram is pushing more towards the right side. And then in like a pretty even image like so, the histogram is more sort in the middle. So what is happening is that what we want to avoid is when the histogram starts clipping, which is this like little arrow that's saying like, hey, there's an error, which means that it's clipping in the blacks. So if I just hover over this, you can see the blue mask happening, and this mask is telling me that in those areas that you see the blue, there's no detail there whatsoever. But actually, there is detail in the rest of it. So let's say, for example, if I try to pull this image um, into itself, I will start decreasing and getting rid of the, the blue mask here, which is also like I'm adding in more information into the photo. Sometimes you can't though, depending on your image. Like usually with an underexposed image like this, it's too dark. You can still pull up those areas of information to a certain extent. Whereas with highlights, when something is too, let's say it's clipping in the whites, let me try to find an image. Oh, like this one. So I can see that it's clipping in my whites here. We've got a little error code in the blue. And these also, they like, there are colors attached to this. So because the image is in color, so you will see that like it clips in certain colors where it's saying like right now, the blue, the blue is kind of clipping as well. So we want to get these to gray where we don't see any sort of error notification or clipping happening. And with this one, you can see that it's clipping into my whites. And what we would do is we would try to bring that information back by bringing this into the middle. But if I just activate this, maybe this is not the best image. Let's try this one. Actually, all right, so we've got like this image here. You can see that it's clipping. And here we go. This is what I was looking for. I wanted to show you the reds. So I turned it on by clicking it on, but you can also just like hover over it and it will show up. But yeah, I'm gonna click it on so you can see it. So all this information here in the reds, this is areas that has no detail whatsoever. And we can try to get that information back, but it is a lot harder with when you overexpose certain areas in your image, or if you have an overexposed image, because it's just sometimes you can't get any of that information back versus underexposing. You can have more luck with pulling that information back. Um, so like, let's say, yeah, if you like overexpose the sky, it's like white and you capture that image, it's really hard to get that information back. Like it will have a certain extent versus like, I mean, they both will, but I have just found that if you overexpose an image and you try to get that detail back, it's harder than if you underexposed an image. Both of them have their certain extents, but yeah. So with that, we can kind of resolve these areas, but um, I will show you that in a little second here. So with the histogram, you can see how it changes. And oh, my crop came on. So if your crop ever comes on, you can basically just hit reset and then it will be the whole area and then you can close it down. But with this image, you can see that it's clipping in my blacks here. You can see that blue overlay. So there's no information there. And to expand on that a little bit more, for example, if we were to print this out, so if you took this class in person, if you were to print this out, that would be all black ink. There is like no information there. And if you were to print out, where was that image? This image that had the really clipped highlights here in the white. If you were to print this out, that would just be white paper. So no ink would lay down on that. And we want to make sure that nothing is too overexposed or too underexposed. We want to make sure that your images aren't clipping. So I will show you how to remedy that, but I just wanted you to be aware, like, what does that mean when it's clipping? It means there's no detail whatsoever. And to provide an example, when you're printing, that's either like no ink is laying down if it's clipping in the whites, or in the blacks, it's just completely black ink. There's no detail in there. So with that said, clipping in the blacks is at 0. So the histogram is from 0 to 255. So 0 is pure black and 255 is pure white. So 0 is over here and 255 is over here. And we want to avoid the histogram touching those areas. So let me find, um, this image here. So again, we're going to start with those two things that I told you: enable the remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And you can see just that enabling of profile corrections has really like brought the image, just giving it more detail. I can see more things already. And let's see, did this change the histogram? It did kind of change the histogram just a little bit. You can see it move just a tiny bit. So there's some more information that has been brought in. And This image is not actually having the issues that it was having earlier, which it was like, um, it was having clipping in the whites. So I'm not seeing that here, which is great. But I think, for example, let me just pull this off to the side. Now this side is clipping. So you can see there's like a little arrow. So let's just pretend that it came in this way. And I think it actually did when I first edited this image. Um, but right now it's clipping. You can see it with the red. So I can actually take this back out by pushing it inwards to the middle. So I'm just clicking and dragging, and you can see it go through those colors, and now it's at gray. So you want to get it to the point right where it gets to gray, and then that should be good. That's where the clipping is gone. Um, and then sometimes there's certain areas, like earlier I was editing this image, and it was like this certain area right here that was not getting rid of that red clipping error message. And sometimes you can't get that information back. And that's kind of what I was talking about in terms of like when you overexpose an area, you're not always able to get that information back. Um, and I know this looks like it's just like a white blob, and when it prints, it might just be white, but honestly, it might have like just a little tint of like gray or yellow to it when it does print, so there still is some information there. But like, for example, can we get this information fully back? I don't think so. Like, the more darker that it gets, Um, actually, the information, even though we got rid of the clipping, like you can see that it's just white, completely white. So the information really isn't in there, because it's just like it wasn't exposed correctly. So we can like make the histogram look better by making it not clip, and it quote unquote is not clipped, but you can still see that in the image because I didn't expose this properly. Um, these areas don't have any information. Whereas on the other end, so if I bring this back to what it did look like before, and again, I'm going to bring this in on the histogram. If I were to bring this side all the way in, you can see that there is indeed a blue sky under there. It's not just black, there is more information there. Um, So going back to this beginning point here, every time, as you can see in the history tab, I go back because I've like made a couple edits. And if I go back here and then let's say I just like bring this in a tiny bit here, watch my enable lens corrections, or sorry, lens profile in the history. Now it's gonna like reset itself, and I just changed the highlights. So you can always go back a couple steps and then add something on top of it, and it will basically get rid of these other things. You can also, on top of that, you can right click on, like, let's say I want to get it back to this point, or you know what, let me do a couple more adjustments. And then I'll explain this a little bit more in 1 second. But for an example, let's say I want to get rid of what I just did. I can just right click and then go clear history above this step, and then it will get rid of that. Or if it was like something more dramatic, I could get it all the way to the beginning here, and you know what, why not? I'll just do it. Clear history above the step, and then I'm starting right at the beginning here. So that's a really, I mean, again, you can't get any of that information back, um, but, or maybe you could do undo history cleared if you really made a mistake and you wanted to get that information back. But what I'm really giving an example of is that Lightroom is really flexible. You could just redo this whole edit thing again if you wanted to. So starting here, we talked about doing these two steps here, and then we talked about the histogram. And as you could see, I was like pulling in from these sections. So maybe let me find another image. This one. So this one is clipping on both my blacks and my whites. You can see the little error messages here. So I'm gonna bring this in, and my goal, like I said, is to get it to where it turns gray, which is it's gray right here. So that's a good part section here, and then also in the whites I'm going to pull it in to the middle, and that's as far as I can go with the whites. And then I'll go to the next section here and pull it in until it turns gray, and we're good to go right there. Sometimes you do have to go to the next section to be able to bring that information back, and I might even just like bring it in a little bit more. So as you can see, the adjustments that I make here are changing the adjustments here in tone. So what you do to the histogram also changes what you do for the tone. So like, you know, it depends on you. Do you want to focus on the histogram or do you want to like focus on the tone area? But they're both going to change either way. So if I bring this back, again, I'm going to bring this back to when I imported. So I'm just going to clear history above the step. You can also just hit reset and that will reset your image as well. And then it will just say reset settings there. But again, that might either get rid of your settings before, or it might keep your history there and just say reset settings above it. I have seen it both ways. So starting over, making sure these lens corrections are checked. And then, as I said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this side in that's clipping on the right where no information is in the whites. And I just want to get it to the section where it just turns gray. And that's good. So that's like where I would stop with my histogram. And then from there, I will add extra adjustments in the tone. Um, I will show you the crop tool here, but everything else I'm going to save for another video. Same thing with like this section here, the white balance, I'm going to save that for another video. So I'm really only sticking in tone, presence, and lens corrections for today. I'll also show you the crop tool just to show you that. And mostly I wanted you to see like the history and how that changes and how it's non-destructive. So continuing with editing this photo, now I can add in different things like exposure. So exposure is going to lighten or darken your whole image. So it does everything in the image, making everything lighter or darker. So it's really up to you. It's like very subjective about how you want to like add exposure. And I would say like in general, it's good to be minimal overall. All these adjustments go up to +5 or -5. So if you wanted to like focus on a certain number, like when I was taught in school, we were taught to just do things like increments of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Um, so like let's say I could do point 0.5, that would get me at 0.50 here. You could also do minus 0.5, what I meant, sorry, is plus, oops, sorry, you don't have to put plus, but you can do 0.05, and that's what I meant, increments of 5. Or you could do minus 0.05, and that would get you -5. You don't have to be that incremental. Like Lightroom is very forgiving, and so you can like do one thing and then change the other. It's really awesome. So feel free to not be so restricted, but I just wanted to show you that like edits can be minimal. They don't have to be that extreme. Like I don't have to do this. You know, obviously that changes my photo a lot, and I want you guys to keep your photos just like by enhancing them, not like especially for this very first project. And since this is your first class, like just try to enhance your photos and make them look like a little bit better, crisper. Maybe the colors pop just a little bit, or the exposure is like a little bit brighter, but you don't need to do something as intense like this because this is fully just changing the image overall. So, oh, I'm sorry. To reset this, you can just double click the word. So I can double click exposure, and that's going to reset it to 0. So anything I do, I can bring it up, and then if I don't want to, if I want it to go back to before, I'll just double click on the word and it will go back to 0. Same thing with tone. Let's say I just like mess with these. I'll explain them in a little bit, in a little second, but you can see like everything changed here, right? If I double click on the word tone, that will reset everything to the beginning. So again, I'm going to bring these clips out. So now that it's just gray arrows, no clipping is happening, and then adjust from there. And yeah, maybe I'll bring up the exposure just a little bit. But as you can see, as I bring up the exposure, the whites are getting pretty close to getting clipped. So you just want to always be aware of your histogram with the edits that you make. And then contrast is, so exposure, to summarize, exposure is brightening or darkening the entire image. Contrast is making the image or certain areas like the subject stand out more by adding darker highlights and shadows and making it, or like adding highlights and shadows rather, intensifying those or like completely dulling them out. So I can make these pop a little bit more, or I can dull them out like that. Contrast can also get very intense very quickly. It works well for this photo, but like certain photos, the contrast could look like too much very quickly. So just be aware of that. And then your highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. I need to find a different image here. So let me go to, let's see, to this image. Okay, so I'm actually going to just start over and edit this one. And talking about your histogram, um, as we could see, just a little bit further information. So like when your histogram is towards the left, that means there's a lot of darks in your image. When your histogram is towards the right, that means there's a lot of brightness in your image. Your image is bright. And then when your histogram is in the middle, this is quote unquote a perfect histogram, as people would say. It has no clipping. But it really is depending on the image itself. Like if you're taking an image at night, your histogram is going to be towards the left. And if you're taking an image during the day, it's most likely going to be towards the right. Of course, we always want to aim for having it like in the middle, but I would argue and say that there is no such thing as a perfect histogram just because of like the way the lighting is. With this image as an example, right now there's no clipping, which is great. We've already checked for that. We've enabled the remove chromatic aberration, enabled profile corrections. And now that there's no clipping, because this image has no clipping, the things that I see here that I would want to adjust is I want like a little bit more separation from the different sections that I have in this image, the sky, the mountains, and the trees. The trees are looking like a little dark for me right here. So I'm going to try to, even though they're not like clipping, we can't see that information. Like the information is not clipping, there is detail there. I'm just going to bring up my blacks a little bit. And actually, maybe let's just start with the exposure. It might be good to start with exposure overall, because this is like your main adjustment. And then from there, then I would go into my whites and blacks. And what I wanted to show you about whites and blacks is that you can also achieve similar results with clipping in here. So your whites are your areas that are clipping in your whites, that could clip in your whites, or you could clip in your blacks. What you can do is you can hold Option on your keyboard if you're on an Apple computer, or Alt on your keyboard if you're on a PC. And if I hold Option down and drag my whites, if I bring them all the way up to +1, I'm still holding Option. I'm going to bring it in all the way till I can't see any white at all, until it's completely black, and then I'll release. And the same thing with my blacks. I'm going to hold Option, bring it to the right now because it's opposite, and I'm going to get it all the way until it turns white and release. And this is supposed to be like a pretty good basis for your image. So like I know it changes the histogram. Sometimes the histogram and the whites and blacks, they actually like lead to the same result. But here I can see that there is some improvement in terms of dimensionality. Like I think the image does look more dimensional. And I'm skipping forward, but I can see a before and after by hitting the Y key on the keyboard. You can also see, you can hit Y here and then choose from these different views. I'm gonna do left right split and just kind of zoom out a little bit. You can also see, like if I keep clicking through here, top and bottom, or I can just keep clicking this button. You can see the different views. So I can see before and after. So I think actually maybe I didn't need to increase the blacks and make it less shadowy. Like I think it does add a nice contrast there. So I'm gonna keep it like that. And then to exit out of like Y, you can just hit Y again. before and after. And then on top of that, like I think it's definitely more dimensional. Now it does look kind of dark. So let me actually just bring it up a little bit more. If I hit option, the image is still white, so there's no clipping in the blacks. Like again, it would be all the way over here if it was clipping in the black, and you would see it in the blue mask. But I'm gonna bring it in. And so anything beyond this point is up to me because it's not gonna clip either way in the blacks at least. And then from there, we could add a little bit of contrast, and you can see contrast gets really intense. Um, a lot of those who are new to editing love to just add like a lot of contrast and a lot of like effects in the presence area, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I feel that it just changes your image too much. You actually don't need that much contrast, so I would be pretty minimal with it. But in the end of the day, it's your photo. But just like I hope you can see the beauty in minimally editing your photo. You're enhancing it, not like so you're not really like changing the photo. So I added some contrast. And then highlights are going to be the areas that are just like there's a lot of white happening in that area. It's not applying it to the whole photo like the whites was or the black was. Highlights and shadows are really looking at the highlights in the image, like maybe these tops of these trees or this area. And the shadows are really going to be just in like the darker areas of this photo, not so much the black points that are happening in here. I hope that makes sense about the differences, but let's go ahead, see if I increase my highlights, you can see most of the highlights are happening in the sky. And let me just turn on the clipping so you can see the clipping in the whites. So if I don't decrease that, then it's going to continue to be clipped. Um, so actually the histogram is giving me a good idea of where I should put this because I don't want it to be clipped. So I'm going to leave it right there where it turns gray, the arrow right there. So it's gray. So my highlights are not too bright. And then same thing with the shadows. We don't have any clipping in the shadows, so we're good to go. And honestly, I kind of like it like really bright. It does change the look, but I think it adds more dimension to the photo overall. So now that the mountain in the background is kind of like standing out a little bit more. And then again, we can see the before and after. So yeah, this image has changed a lot, but I would say it's mostly like the exposure tone that's changed. I'm just making the image better. It is more of an enhancement, but before, I mean, we could not do that big change. I honestly do kind of like it. But I'll just show you like maybe I would have brought it to like here, and that's pretty good. And it does change the image. It's just like a brighter image overall. But if I do pump those shadows, it does change the look, but I do kind of like that. So I'm gonna keep it. I still think overall it's like the same image. We haven't really changed much. I know that this step was kind of extreme with the shadows, but I think it looks really cool. Um, it kind of separates foreground, midground, and background, which I'll talk about more in the future. But another thing here, let's see, what else could we do? Maybe I can like decrease the exposure just a little bit. Yeah, so now it's at 20 rather than 35. And I could also, maybe I'll just decrease my highlights just a tiny bit as well so that this is not so bright. And I feel like that looks pretty good. The other things that I wanted to talk to you about is presence here. So there is texture, clarity, and dehaze. Um, Texture and clarity, I feel like they've improved a lot throughout the years. It used to be like very extreme and it would change the image a lot. I'll show you an example of what that can do for like more like an image like this. Um, but dehaze is one that I still am not a big fan of. And yeah, let me actually go to this image. So again, enable these two settings here, and then my histogram is in the middle, so I don't have to worry about any clipping. And then I can go straight into editing. So I might just like bring the exposure up, add a little bit of contrast. Maybe just adjusting the highlights and the shadows a bit. And then the whites and blacks, like I said, option, hold, and then just bring it to right where it hits black. Whites, option, hold, right where it hits white. And now it's like already a lot of dimension happening with the whites and blacks. I can see that it's clipping in the whites here, so I am gonna just bring that in a little bit. And maybe now it looks like there might be just a little bit too much contrast, so I might take that out. All right, so then moving on to texture, clarity, and dehaze. So texture is going to like, it kind of makes things sharper, but it's also enhancing the texture, and it does a lot better in this updated program of 2024. Um, clarity, you can see how that really changes the image. I'm going to turn off the clipping. These both affect the histogram as well too, because it's making changes. So like, yeah, this image is completely different than before. Um, this is where I'm saying I think that the edits are a little bit too extreme here, and that's a good example of what clarity can do. So let's say I just take off texture. Um, yeah, clarity just does that on its own. So it looks really, it's trying to make everything more clear. Um, or if you take it all the way down, then it's like really blurry. So it looks like a painting. So we want to use this to enhance it, not change it. And that's where clarity can be a little bit intense. And texture is definitely a little bit more minimal. So especially nowadays, compared to before. So I don't have too much of an issue with texture. But yeah, I hope you can see how that really changes the look of things with clarity. And then dehaze. I'm really not a big fan of this in general. I just think I don't really like the effect. Dehaze is meant for like whenever your photo is looking kind of hazy, maybe it's not like super sharp, or you've got like a little bit of like a flare happening off of like a highlight of a reflective material, or your image has like a lot of fog in it or something. Anything where your image would look kind of hazy, that's where you would use dehaze. I guess I kind of like it for the fact that it is bringing in some of these pinks here in this image that I wasn't able to see before. So I'm going to reset these. So I can see like a little bit of pink. Texture doesn't really add much. Clarity doesn't add much of that pink, but dehaze does add that. And again, just know that it's always changing. It is changing your histogram. So you want to check your histogram as you make the adjustments. Um, and then vibrance and saturation, these can also get really intense really fast. Maybe like honestly, I guess 20 is not too bad, but you could just do like maybe point 10, point 15. I don't know why it's not working. Oh, okay. I think these work in a different increment, not just fives. Oh, okay, sorry. It doesn't do points, 0.05 like this one was doing up here. So that's why I was like kind of struggling. But I guess I could just do five, and that would be an increment of five, or -5. So yeah, maybe just an increment of 10. Um, but yeah, saturation, like if I pull this all the way, the saturation is applying to the whole photo, and vibrance is only affecting like certain areas. It also changes the colors in a different way. These can get really extreme really fast, so I would just be careful with them because it starts to look like a painting rather than a photograph. Um, so yeah, these ones I'm like a little bit more weary of, and dehaze. Not the biggest fan of those three, but play to your heart's content. And then um, another example, let's do this one. So I'm actually going to just reset this image. And as you can see, when I resetted this image, it still has my full history there, and it just kept the reset settings up here. So for this image, again, bringing in the clipping so it's not clipping anymore. This image, like I just want to keep things true to the environment. So this was shot early in the morning. You can see that like yellow sunrise sun happening. And so I don't want to make this like too bright. For example, if I were to do this, this is completely changing the whole image. Now it looks like it's like happening in the day. It's like a bit overexposed. I don't want to do that. I just kind of want to like enhance it just a touch. Maybe just adding like a tiny bit of contrast, a little bit of exposure, watching my histogram to make sure nothing is happening, and also enabling these before I get too carried away. Enabling those did kind of change the garage here. You see before versus after I've done it. So it's like not as dark. So maybe then I would decrease my exposure just a touch. And then I'm actually kind of liking like adding more, like decreasing my shadows all the way so that the shadows are not as dark. That seems to be a pretty cool effect for these photos. Um, and then let's see, highlights, these can get really bright really quick, so not adjusting those too much. Whites and blacks, I'll try the option here to the point where it gets completely black. And then blacks, I'll do that until it comes to completely white. And now I can see that this is a little bit overexposed. So this kind of changed my image a little bit than what it was before. Actually, it's kind of similar, but maybe what I would recommend more so now is like adjust your histogram, then do the whites and blacks trick if you would like, with the option, holding option or alt down. To refer back to your histogram, make sure nothing's clipping, and then going into exposure, contrast, highlights, and shadows to adjust from there. Because like if you make these adjustments like I just did, and then I did the whites and blacks, it kind of did change my image a little bit. It's not too bad, but like let's say you went further, it could kind of set you back rather than improving things. So it might be better to do your histogram, make sure nothing's clipping, then checking your whites and blacks, and then going into these other settings here. So with texture, I'm just going to bring this all the way up so you can see, because this image does have more texture. But the more texture that I bring in, it's going to bring in more of that noise that's happening from my just my camera in general, and like maybe the ISO that I had. Um, and then clarity is also going to really intensify those things. So it doesn't look like that bad, but I just think now it looks a little bit too, like it's too intense in certain areas. So I'm not going to use as much clarity or as much texture. And also in the opposite end, those blur everything as well. So I don't even think I need to use those, to be honest. Um, like I said, dehaze completely changes the image. So I'm not a big fan of that either. And just wanted to show you like these can get really, they can change your image a lot. Same thing, vibrance. And now you can see a better example of how vibrance changes only certain areas of the photo, whereas saturation changes the whole image and makes the whole image black and white. Let's see, this vibrance. Vibrance can make things kind of black and white, but you still see colors in them. Whereas saturation makes the image completely black and white. And then a note on black and white for your images in this class. I would hope that you just stick in color, because I think it's best to be able to understand our edits in color. And when you're editing in black and white, I think you can just get away with a lot more. And I just want you to be able to learn how to fully edit your images to the best extent possible before choosing to just go straight to black and white. I'm not completely opposed to black and white for maybe like your final, after you've really experimented with it, but you have to have a good reason why as to why you chose to do things in black and white versus color. So I hope that makes sense with these. And the next couple things I'm going to show you um, are cropping, and then also copying and pasting settings. So with cropping, this is the crop tool right here. Again, since you're first starting out, I wouldn't really want you to crop so much in your image. I just want you to know about this tool. Um, what I would recommend is that you just keep this locked, the lock locked, because that makes sure when you're pulling your image in, I always pull from the right upper hand corner. It's keeping everything proportional. When I pull in and expand, everything is proportional. When you unlock it, I could then make this like a vertical image, but that's just dependent on what kind of image you're creating. But if you want to crop, honestly, you should be doing that in camera as well. Like if you want a vertical image, change the way that your orientation, you're holding your camera, make it vertical. You should be doing that in camera. But I do know that there's maybe like after you look at an image, you're like, you know what, this might look better vertically. I understand those are times for that, but I would still say remain like having your proportions locked. And now that we've made this image vertical, we can still, you know, make sure that the proportions are locked and go from there. And then, by the way, after you've kind of decided the cropping that you want, you can drag inside. It's not going to work outside in the gray here, but it's going to work inside the crop that you can drag it around and change your image. So under here, this drop down, I'm going to go back to as shot. You can also do like 1:1, which is a square. This would be like if you wanted to, for example, um, post your image on Instagram and you wanted it in a square for some reason, or there's also different frames, like this is letter size paper. This is 5:7 or 4:6 for like if you wanted a smaller image to put in a frame. Those are different types of frame sizes. And then I'm just going to keep this as shot. And then from there, again, making sure this is locked. And maybe I would only take it in like just this much. Or maybe I would do original, which is just like this large, and then pulling it in from there and only cropping in like this. So just cropping it in so that the image is like a little bit more focused on what I want it to focus rather than having all the outside information. But I'm going to reset this and then close it because I actually do like the cropping of this image. Um, but another thing you can do is you can play with the angle of an image. So let's say if this image was not completely straight, it's pretty good, but I could go into the crop tool and then I could kind of angle this. Let's say I'll just do something like this as an example, and then I can click the crop and it will set that crop. So now I made my image angular. But that was just an example of like, let's say this was just a tiny bit not straight. You can use those lines to straighten it. And I could set it like so. Maybe this is a little bit straighter. Um, this does kind of affect my crop as well. But yeah, you can definitely play with the angle if your things aren't straight. Your image is not straight. Okay, so I'm going to reset and then close. So that's cropping. Hopefully it makes sense. If you want to crop, keep it locked, crop it in, bring it in like a little bit. You don't have to do too much cropping. And then to set it, you can either close or you can just click the crop button again. So you can also reset it, which is great. That's why it's not, Lightroom is non-destructive. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just copying and pasting your settings. So let's say, actually there is an image. I like this image. I edited it. It's like, for example, if I hit the Y before and after, I can see what it looked like before and my edits after. Before it was like a little bit too dark and underexposed, and then I kind of edited, edited it to make it just overall more dimensional. Hit the Y key to go ahead and go back to the original view. But again, Y is before and after. And then from there, let's say I want to copy these settings and put them on my other photos that were taken at the same place at the same time of day. I can hit copy, and then I would have all these settings here to choose from. I selected these ones. You can unselect the ones that I unselected here. You really just want to keep your copy settings like as basic as possible. Eventually we'll get into like healing and masking and cloning and things like that. You wouldn't want to copy those over because your subject might change, and then those same like masking, healing, all of that will be copied over as well. So those are like customized things that you don't really want to keep to every photo, but since we just did basic edits, we can go ahead and do that. And I'm noticing as I'm talking that this is clipped here, so I'm going to bring that in a little bit. But yeah, now I can go ahead and copy, and I'll just copy basically these settings. They're all checked that I want. Nothing is super customizable, so I'm keep unchecking everything that's customizable. Then I'm going to hit copy, and then I can go to this image and I can hit paste, and it will paste my effect onto there, my settings. But you can see that it's clipping, like maybe this wasn't the best example or photo, but it does change the image. So I can go ahead and hit paste again, and it might look better in this image. But again, it kind of like gets you to the same effect, but then you might have to just edit on top of that just a tiny bit. And a more dramatic example of copying and pasting, that's how you would just copy and paste one image by one image. But let's say I wanted to, I'm just going to make a really dramatic edit and just expose this like that so you can see the differences. And let's say I wanted to paste it to a couple more images, not just one. I'm going to do all the way up to here. So I just click the first image and then hold shift, click the last image to grab a group, or click the first image, hold command if you're on a Mac, or hold control on a PC, and then you can select image by image like so. But I'm just going to click the first one, hold shift, click the last one, and this is the range that I want to copy. And this cropping tool keeps coming up, which I think is one of these tools right here. So I'm just going to reset that and close it. I keep bringing that up for some reason. Yes, it's this tool right here. It's like an automatic crop, so just be careful when you're touching things. So yeah, I'm going to reset that and close. So aim to select from the middle, and then you can avoid it. But yeah, copy these settings, and then I'm going to copy them as I just did. Hold shift, grab the images that I want to paste it to. If I hit paste, it's only gonna paste to this very first one. It's not gonna paste to every single one. So instead I'm gonna hit synchronize, sync, and then hit synchronize, and it's gonna apply to all those images. So now all these images have that same setting. And I know that's not like the greatest edit, I just wanted you to see what that effect would do. So yeah, that's copying and pasting, how to basically do basic edits to your photos. Eventually we'll get into more, just more editing, advanced editing in Lightroom. But for now, that is everything. So go ahead and have fun and edit, and I hope you learned a lot today.